Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another of the Spring Seminar Series presentations hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is James Horncastle, and I am the Edward and Emily McQuinney Professor in International Relations in the Department of Global Humanities, and I will be responsible for moderating today's talk. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. I am pleased to present today's speaker and my friend, Dr. Katerina Lagos. Dr. Lagos is a professor of history at California State University, Sacramento, and director of the California State University System Hellenic Studies Program and the Angelos Tsakopoulos Hellenic Studies Center. She is the president of the Modern Greek Studies Association and member of the Modern Greek Studies Foundation, San Francisco. Her research interests focus on modern Greece, with an emphasis on fascism, minorities, education, identity, and dictatorships. Dr. Lagos' recent book, and the basis for today's talk, The 4th of August Regime in Greek Jewry, 1936 through 1941, explores the Metaxas regime's relationship with Greece's Jewish population and helps to dispel several of the myths surrounding the topic. I hope you all enjoyed today's presentation from Dr. Lagos.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you all. Thank you to the Simon Fraser Hellenic Studies Program for being such wonderful collegial friends and colleagues. So I see this more as a seminar of discussion and exchange of ideas. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I do have a copy of the book that will be given to the library. So if you ever have insomnia, make sure you pick up this copy. It works wonders. In November 1937, General Ioannis Metaxas was inducted into the Golden Book of the Jewish National Fund by the Zionists of Greece. The rabbi of Thessaloniki, Zvi Koretz, congratulated Metaxas on reestablishing an atmosphere of peace and calm for the Jews since he had taken over power on August 4, 1936. This tribute to a dictator whose ideological leanings have been compared to General Franco of Spain, seems puzzling in the context of European affairs. While most European authoritarian regimes enacted anti-Jewish legislation, as well as neighboring Turkey and the Soviet Union, the Metaxas dictatorship seemed to have taken a contrary position. Additionally, Metaxas' stance towards the Jews was far more favorable than that of Eleftherios Venizelos, head of the Liberal Party and the democratically elected Prime Minister of Greece, who dominated Greek politics since 1910. Despite these contradictions, very little has been written about the induction of Metaxas in 1937, either by scholars of the Metaxas period or by Jewish studies scholars. The history of Christian-Jewish relations in Greece, both leading up to and during Metaxas' rule, is complex, with separate Jewish communities varying differently under ever-evolving definitions of what it meant to be Greek. This paper will focus on how Metaxas affects this evolving definition of Greekness and the degree to which Jews would be included. Metaxas differentiated himself from other dictators of the interwar period. Metaxas would not espouse anti-Semitic policies, nor would he acquiesce to Nazi directives concerning German Jews coming to Greece. There was no Jewish question for Metaxas. Instead, territorial revisionism still dominated the discourse in the various governmental ministries. Metaxas continued the policies of Hellenization that had existed prior to his assumption of power as a means to buttress the territorial boundaries of the country. Minorities that resisted assimilation suffered tremendously. They were the unfortunate casualties of the territorial politics of the region. Jewish persecution became a growing issue on the European continent, and this persecution prompted greater attention to the Jews by Metaxas. But Metaxas defended them as civic members of the Greek state. In the face of persecution, both internally and externally, Metaxas provided assistance to the Jews of Greece. Indeed, what differentiated Metaxas from all other European leaders is that he was willing to offer support and assistance to Jews facing persecution, including foreign Jews residing in or traveling through Greece. To this end, and despite assumptions to the contrary, Metaxas remained firm in his beliefs and provided a final respite for the Jews prior to Greece's involvement in World War II. In my paper today, I will be discussing three topics. I will provide a general overview of the Jewish communities of Greece, the rise of territorially driven political anti-Semitism during the 19th century, and lastly, the binary paradigm of inclusion and exclusion that dominated during the Metaxas dictatorship and its impact on the Jews of Greece. So now let's turn to the Jewish communities in Greece. There are two basic communities that dominate the Greek landscape, the Romagnots and the Sephardim. The Romagnots were among those Jews who had existed in the Greek land since antiquity and spoke Greek, which was not only used for daily communication, but was even incorporated in the Romagnot religious services. The term Romagnot was adopted by the Jews during Byzantine period and, quote, indicated their cultural outlook and sense of belonging to the population of the Romei, or Greek speakers in the Balkans. It also reflects the Jewish status as former citizens of the Roman Empire, Roman Jews, and underscores an unbroken tradition throughout their rich and vibrant history. The Romagnots originated geographically from Palestine and dispersed through the Eastern Mediterranean, becoming the oldest Jewish presence in the Greek lands, the Greek state lands, and forming the earliest Jewish communities. By the 18th century, the Romagnots dominated the communities of Ioannina, Nafpaktos, Arta, Preveza in the western part of the mainland, while in the Peloponnese, Romagnots comprised the Jewish communities of Patra, Mistra, and Modon. Further east were the communities in Thiva, Veria. Athens was also a Romagnot community that existed since the Hellenistic period, but disappeared during the period of the Greek War of Independence. With the arrival of King Othon, the new capital of Athens gradually reestablished a Romagnot community and also incorporated incoming Ashkenazi Jews who had accompanied the young king to Greece. The sole Jewish community in Evia, Chalkida, was also a Romagnot community that dates back to 586 BCE. Chalkida was a popular destination for Jews in Chalkida, or Chalkis, depending on how it's translated, was a popular destination for Jews, and many came to the city as free tradesmen or were forcibly brought in as slaves or indentured workers. In antiquity, the island of Crete also had communities with majority of Romagnots in Iraklion, Chania, and Rethymnon. So you can see that down here. The Romagnots on Crete spoke Greek, had Greek names, Greek-sounding names, and had a synagogue ritual that was partly conducted in the Greek language. In contrast to the long-established presence of the Romagnot, the Sephardim were relative newcomers to the Balkan Peninsula. The Sephardim are Jews who left the Iberian Peninsula, beginning in Spain in 1391 and culminating with the Reconquista policies of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in Spain and King Manuel I of Portugal at the end of the 15th century to settle in other areas of Europe, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire. The early Sephardic immigrants to the Balkans settled in Crete, Constantinople, Adrianople, and were embraced by the local Romagnot communities, while the latter wave of settlement spread throughout the Ottoman Empire, including Thessaloniki, Belgrade, Edirne, Constantinople, Bursa, and Izmir. This second wave of Sephardic immigration is significant, as the sheer number of individuals coming to the Greek lands would overshadow, if not replace, the existing Jewish presence. The Sephardim settled in many of the towns that the Romagnots were forced to abandon by the Ottomans. The Romagnot communities of Kastoria, Thessaloniki, Kavala, and Dimotico along the historic Via Egnatia, past the very top, as well as those communities of Lamia and Veria on the Aegean coast to the south, were ordered in 1455, these people, to leave their homes and relocate to the imperial capital or elsewhere in the empire by decree of Surgun by Sultan Mehmed II. In their place, later, Sultan Bayezid would welcome the incoming Sephardim and allow them to settle in these and other wealthier cities in the empire. The influx of Sephardim to Thessaloniki, for example, would lead to its characterization as one of the largest and most prominent Sephardic settlements in the empire. Sephardic Thessaloniki, Salonika, would even come to be considered a Jewish city, with the appellation of Jerusalem in the Balkans. This demographic dominance would continue uninterrupted until the interwar period. You could use 1928, so one of the years that I use. In addition to the strong presence in Thessaloniki, the Sephardim would gradually dominate existing Jewish communities in the eastern and central parts of Greece, including Larissa, which is considered the oldest Jewish community in the Greek lands, as mentioned earlier, and was even called the mother of Israel. Trikala, Ceres, Drama, Vivimotiko, and Kavala all became prominent Sephardic communities to the north, while the islands of the Aegean were also notable areas of settlement by the Sephardim. Most of the Aegean islands with an existing Jewish community were soon outnumbered and culturally assimilated by the incoming Sephardim. Both the islands of Chios and Rhodes reflected the transition of Jewish community dominance from Romaniote to Sephardim. Ottoman officials considered both the Romaniotes and Sephardim as part of the same millet, yet differentiated between them, ultimately privileging the Sephardim not only in legal and economic terms, but also elevating many Sephardic Jews to important positions in the Sultan's court. One of the critical differences between the two communities is that the Romaniotes were given the status of surgun, part of the defeated Byzantines, and saddled with various taxes and limitations on mobility, while the Sephardim were given the status of kendigelen, voluntary migrants, and did not have the same restrictions or tax burdens. The categorization of the Romaniotes as surgun, along with the Greek Christians, would also have implications on their general status within the empire. They were treated like the Orthodox population and suffered persecution, forced conversions, and targeted as candidates for def shermeh, meaning having male children taken for the military. The entire Jewish populations of Macedonia, Thrace, and Rumeli that were forcibly removed and relocated in 1455, ironically the same year that a separate Jewish millet was created. A final pejorative onomastic term was given to the Romaniotes, and this was actually given by the Sephardim. Both the Romaniotes and the synagogues were referred to as Gregos. This derisive term was used widely and explains why the sole Romaniote synagogue on Rhodes, mentioned above, was called Gregos. In contrast, the Sephardim were assisted in their settlement within the Ottoman Empire. Chief Rabbi Kapsalis undertook the responsibility of feeding and taking care of the Sephardic refugees once they arrived, helping to make arrangements for their permanent settlement. Over time, the Sephardim gradually acculturated themselves to their Ottoman environment, including wearing headgear similar to Ottoman officials and proclaiming them as Turkish Jews. This self-proclamation linked the Sephardim to the Ottoman ruling caste and reinforced their separateness from the Romaniotes, who maintained their pre-existing linguistic, cultural, and religious traditions as members of the subjugated Greek community. It would not be incorrect to assume that the Sephardim considered themselves superior to the other Jewish communities in the empire and took steps to institutionalize their perceived status. They established their own synagogues, communities, and courts of religious laws, which the Ottoman government recognized and supported. So now let's go to the Greek War of Independence. Prior to the Ottoman conquest of the region, relations between the existing Romaniotes and Greek Christians were largely shaped by the Greek Orthodox Church. The Byzantine state had sanctioned and institutionalized legal, social, and fiscal discrimination of the Jews. The Orthodox Church then compounded this discrimination by socially marginalizing Jews, criticizing them as deicides and desecrator of Christian symbols. Indeed, Jews came to be disparaged by the all socioeconomic strata of Byzantine Christian society. Predominantly religious factors helped shape the stereotypes of the Jews, and these factors continued to influence their treatment up through Ottoman times. One of the most persistent anti-Semitic accusations leveled against the Jews that became prevalent throughout both Europe and the Ottoman Empire is the allegation of blood libel. While this accusation had its root in antiquity, it would gain popularity during the medieval period in Central and Western Europe. Jews were accused of sacrificing a Christian, most preferably a child, so that the blood could be used to make matzah for Passover. In the East, however, accusations of blood libel did not gain currency in Byzantium, not even during the early centuries of the Ottoman Empire, not as much. It was not a prevalent factor as we saw in the West. Gradually, though, blood libel accusations gained currency in the mid-18th century and came to form a common accusation by the Greek Christians following their independence. Additionally, the Orthodox Church maintained its denunciation of the Jews for their betrayal of Christ, leading to his crucifixion, but stopped short of supporting the violent persecution. The Orthodox Church sanctioned and institutionalized social marginalization of the Jews through theology, polemical writing, preaching, hagiographic tales, and visual representations. Holy Friday services prior to Easter included a condemnation of Judas for betraying Christ, and Jews would avoid going outside on that evening because of the heightened tensions that these accusations generated. The burning of a Judas effigy became a characteristic feature of Holy Week, and one that both Greek governmental leaders, since independence, and church leaders would be hard-pressed to denounce and suppress. Sometimes you even hear about these today. While religious anti-Semitism served as a foundation for anti-Jewish hatred in Greece, political anti-Semitism linked with territorial expansion emerged in the early 19th century as a new force of discrimination, beginning with the Greek War of Independence. During the Greek Revolution, Greek participation was not uniformly the same. Despite military and material support given by some Jews for the revolution, public perception was dominated by the substantial number of Jews who fought alongside the Ottoman forces and did not assist the Greek Christians in their bid for political independence. As a result, the War of Independence proved to be a watershed moment in Greek Christian-Jewish relations. The relatively peaceful coexistence of Romaniote and Christian-Jewish communities throughout the centuries of Ottoman rule came to an end. Greek Christians considered the Jews as allies of the Turks and overlooked many examples of Jewish support. A new form of anti-Semitic hostility would be established. Jews were considered antithetical to Hellenism and who resisted territorial inclusion and/or cultural assimilation. This form of political anti-Semitism incorporated territorial dimensions and became a characteristic feature as the Greek state expanded through military conflict. The military acquisitions of Crete, Thrace, Macedonia, especially Thessaloniki and Epirus, all resulted in outbreaks of hostilities towards the Jews that was driven by political anti-Semitism. Political anti-Semitism, though, was not widespread in all of Greece, nor did it occur continuously. For diplomatically acquired territorial expansion, little, if any, anti-Semitic hostility occurred. The political and territorial-based anti-Semitism culminated in the 20th century with a violence that occurred during the Balkan Wars and World War I. With the demise of the Megali Idea, we could say 1922, and the territorial expansionist policies by Greek politicians, the legacy of political anti-Semitism could be seen in the perception of Jewish anti-Hellenism, especially by the Sephardim during the interwar period and by administration in regards to their Hellenization policies. This perception of Jewish anti-Hellenic sentiment saw the Jews, especially the Sephardim, as a foreign element that refused to assimilate into Greek society. Beginning with the military struggle on the island of Crete to Greece and ending with the incorporation of Thessaloniki, a pattern of tension emerged during the first decades of the 20th century that categorized Jews, especially the Sephardim, as foreigners who were reluctant to join the Greek state and reluctant to assimilate in Greek society. Thus, a collision course between the Megali Idea and Sephardic cultural autonomy was therefore established in the north, culminating with a Campbell pogrom in 1931 at Thessaloniki, which would shape Christian-Jewish relations in northern Greece during the latter part of the interwar period. The Greek nationalism would take on a defensive characteristic and call into question Venizelos' proclamation that, quote, a Greek is a person who wants to be Greek, feels he is Greek, and says he is Greek. In Venizelos' expansionist agenda, the Sephardim of Thessaloniki not only needed to feel and wish to be Greek, but more importantly, adhere to the new realities of their day-to-day existence within the Greek state. Now let's go to the Metaxas period. So we have here an image of the megalithea, I think. Okay. Metaxas would inherit this climate of tension and take concerted steps to curb political hostilities. Potential hostilities. Banning anti-Semitic articles and the EEE, Ethniki, Enosis, Elinon, which is the National Union of Greeks, but also had like an anti-Semitic spin to it, Greeks against the Jews, Hellenes enondion Hebreon, especially in Thessaloniki. However, he would intensify Venizelos' and other interwar administrations' Hellenizing policies. The consistency between Metaxas and the previous interwar administrations regarding the implementation of Hellenization policies reflects a unique situation that underscores the priority given to national consolidation. To a great extent, national consolidation equaled territorial consolidation, and this was a key factor in interwar foreign policy. The years leading up to 1936 are critical as they shape the discourse and policies for the remainder of the decade. During the 1930s, Greece faced political instability similar to that of other European countries. By 1936, the rise of fascist regimes seemed to present to many Greek intellectuals and politicians a stable and viable alternative form of government that would address the state's political instability. The death of 6 prominent politicians, Venizelos, George Kondilis, Constantine Demertsis, Panagis Tsaldaris, Paul Koundouriotis, and Alexandros Zaimis, left a vacuum in political leadership. More specifically, the death of Demertsis on April 13, 1936, left Greece without a prime minister, and King George took swift action to find a replacement. Although he did not discuss the situation with any of the remaining political party leaders, King George instead chose Deputy Minister General Ioannis Metaxas to be sworn in as prime minister. Over the course of the summer, the machinations of the politicians opposed to Metaxas attempted to form a coalition government. At this point, Metaxas contemplating a coup d'etat. On July 22nd, following a meeting between the king and the head of the Liberal Party, Themistoklis Opoulis, regarding a proposed coalition, Metaxas pressed King George to allow him to overthrow government. The public justification for the overthrow, however, would not mention the king's dissatisfaction with the proposed coalition, but rather centered on a supposed impending public worker strike and its links to communism. Metaxas became dictator on August 4, 1936, and his regime lasted in power until his death on January 29, 1941. While the Metaxas dictatorship borrowed many aspects of other European fascist regimes at the time, his ideological outlook remained consistent to his past political and social convictions. In this regard, his political and military experience had a formative impact on the regime and its goals. Although Metaxas broke with previous Greek politicians in his avoidance of military irredentist policies, like Venizelos, Metaxas considered language and religion to be the primary determinants of Greek identity, and this was consistently reinforced during his tenure in power. Metaxas did not espouse biological or racial views of ethnic identity, but rather based his ethnic conceptualization on cultural criteria. In terms of domestic policy, Metaxas embarked on a project of cultural regeneration that would unify Greek society. He envisioned creating a new third Hellenic civilization that would revive the attributes of ancient Greece and Byzantium within Greek society. He emphasized the influence of the Greek ethnos on Western civilization, stating that, quote, our ethnos has left its mark on the entire world. Today's civilization originates from our ancient civilization. His new civilization emphasized a cultural regeneration predicated on 3 aspects: religion, family, and homeland. Metaxas repeated these aspects fanatically during his tenure in power. He also used this Hellenization, Hellenopes, to counter European cosmopolitanism. Yet not all Greeks were considered members of this future civilization. Through Metaxas' speeches concerning language, religion, and equality, a paradigm of ethnic inclusion and exclusion was constructed that affected all individuals living in Greece. Greekness would naturally exclude various minority groups from participating in Metaxas' cultural revival. The Jews comprised one such minority group whose unique attributes did not correspond to Metaxas' vision. Since religious affiliation was a critical determinant for membership to the Greek ethnos, the Jews of Greece, along with other non-Orthodox Christians, faced a difficult choice of either maintaining their religious beliefs and exclusion from the ethnos, or conversion to Greek Orthodoxy and exclusion and inclusion into the ethnos. In this manner, Metaxas continued the cultural interpretation of Greek identity that Eleftherios Venizelos publicly articulated, providing opportunities for inclusion to those individuals who did not have an Orthodox Christian religious affiliation. Membership to the Greek ethnos was open to many, but it came at the expense of religious assimilation. This was non-negotiable. For the Jews, Metaxas' speeches underscored the paradigm of inclusion and exclusion in which they found themselves. Even though Jews were excluded from the Greek ethnos because of their religious beliefs, they could selectively be included in the state's various political and economic affairs. Jews could be political supporters of the Metaxas regime. They could be equal economic participants in the regeneration of the state, but they would nevertheless be perceived by the regime as having a separate ethnic identity because of their religious affiliation and also, to some extent, of their different language. This perception of Jewish separateness is exemplified in Metaxas' speech to the Thessaloniki Jewish community on March 25, 1937, at the Bet Saul synagogue. Metaxas was thanking the Jewish community, especially the Zionists of Greece, for inducting him into the Golden Book of the Jewish National Fund, my introduction to today's presentation. Rabbi Zvi Koretz of Thessaloniki presented Metaxas with a diploma and congratulated him on reestablishing an atmosphere of peace and calm for the Jews in Greece. Metaxas responded by shedding light upon the historic ties between Greek Jews and Christians. In this short speech, Metaxas explicitly differentiated between Jews and Greek Christians. He used phrases such as the Jewish nation with the Greek and the Jewish nation, ethnos, within the Greek. One of the most striking phrases in this speech was Metaxas' claim of Greece being a home for the Jewish settlers, despite the fact that the Jews have inhabited Greek territory since ancient times. This reference to Jewish settling reinforced both the perception that Jews were latecomers to the Greek lands, and also that they were foreigners who migrated to new territories that were, by inference, not their historic home. The Greek lands were the historic home of the Greek Orthodox Christians. All of these comments serve to underscore the separate status of the Jews within the Greek body politic and subsequently their exclusion from the new Third Greek civilization. This perception of Jewish separateness translated into Jewish exclusion from the cornerstone of the new regime, Eon, Ethniki Oργάνωση Νεολαίας, the National Organization of Youth. Metaxas established this Greek youth organization on November 7, 1936, by Emergency Law 334. Eon formed one of the cornerstones of Metaxas' new regime that would fulfill his vision of a third Greek civilization. He wished to create a youth movement that would serve as a popular basis of support for the regime and its ideological principles through future generations. The creation of Aeon was vital to the regime because, unlike Mussolini and Hitler, Metaxas did not have a mass political party that came to power with him in August of 1936. Metaxas served as a president of Aeon, while Crown Prince Paul served as the patron of the movement. Prince Paul and his wife, Frederica, were to promote the interests of the organization and help raise funds. Wealthy Athenians such as Alexandros Kanellopoulos gave generous financial contributions to the organization that allowed members to obtain uniforms free of charge, stage parades, and organize other events. While Aeon targeted children from all socioeconomic strata of Greek society, it was not aimed towards non-Christian youth. In Article 3 of Aeon's administrative charter, membership into the organization was open to, quote, all Christian citizens of Greek nationality, ethnikotitas, regardless of sex, from the age of 8 years old to 25 years old, end quote. Metaxas himself stressed the religious character of Aeon and explicitly stated that Aeon was, quote, a Christian organization because this is the religion with which our nation, our ethnos, was for centuries tightly interwoven. This is not open to discussion, but what we want to say is that the movement is Christian and holds first to Orthodox dogma that dominates in Greece, and after this, all the dogmas of Christianity. Metaxas also stated that members of Aeon would participate in religious ceremonies, quote, as much as possible, so as to always show their complete respect to the Christian faith. Metaxas was equally explicit in his discussion of non-Christians and how they should be treated. He demanded that respect be shown to those who were not, quote unquote, Greek, and encouraged the youth of Aeon never, quote, to be the reason for thwarting the religious convictions of others, because the respect for the religious convictions of non-Christians must be complete. Metaxas threatened that if Aeon members ever wanted to become the reason for thwarting the religious belief of others, Metaxas would no longer consider them belonging to Aeon. An intriguing aspect of Metaxas' speech centers on the issue of non-Christians joining Aeon. Metaxas stated that if non-Christians wanted to join this Christian organization, and I'm sorry, I'm emphasizing Christian a lot, and he did so too, then they were free to do so. He stressed that, quote, if there exist non-Christian parents who want with all their soul that their children to join this organization with complete awareness that this organization is purely Christian and that their children also want to join, we, with goodwill, will examine this wish, since we first make completely sure, examining every case separately, that no pressure from anyone, not the slightest, has been exerted, not on the parents and nor on the children, end quote. With this statement, Metaxas opened a small window of opportunity for Jews and other non-Christians to apply for membership to Aeon. According to Article 5 of the Administrative Charter, the acceptance or rejection of an individual's application resided solely with the local Aeon officers. And I want to emphasize that a lot of the policies and directives by the Metaxas dictatorship relied heavily on the local organizations, how they interpreted, how they implemented. So I hope you all don't get the sense that this was like expanded and everyone kind of followed suit. A lot of policies, even ecclesiastical ones, you will have religious leaders saying we condemn X behavior, but local priests would do something completely different. So I just want to point that out. For example, Jews in Corfu were encouraged to apply for membership by local Aeon officers, but in Thessaloniki, they were discouraged from applying. The manner in which the Jews were discouraged from applying was informal, and often Jews themselves would discourage other Jews from applying. In interviews conducted with the author, Rosa Benveniste, Ilias Katsopoulos, Iacovos Frizis, Salvadori Burla, Mary Cohen, and Renee Morfo, all describe similar situations for discouraging Jews from joining Aeon. Even though all six stated that there were no written rules barring Jewish entry into Aeon, there were nevertheless indirect pressures from others to discourage their membership. The examples of both Rosa Benveniste and Ilias Katsopoulos are emblematic of such pressure. Almost all of the individuals interviewed did not submit an application for membership to Aeon. Ilias Katsopoulos was informed that Jews would not be allowed to join, and one of his Christian friends, who happened to be a member of Aeon, advised him not to apply. Rosa Benveniste described how pressure was placed on Jews even at the membership desk. If a Jew tried to submit an application, individuals at the membership desk would look over the application form and give it back to the individual, recommending that he or she not apply. Thereupon, that application would be placed in a membership rejection book held at the local Eon administrative offices, so it would be available for inspection in case applications in the future included among them previously rejected applications. So that was a way to bar people from reapplying if somebody else happened to be at the desk. Since an individual was required to apply for membership at his or her local Eon chapter, it would be highly unlikely that a rejected individual would ever be accepted for membership in another chapter. The size and location of a Jewish community could also determine if a Jew had a good chance of being accepted into Eon, or even being allowed to fill out the application form. Membership into Eon was directly related, often, on the given size of a Jewish community. The larger the community, the more unlikely membership became. In communities such as Thessaloniki, it is unknown whether there were any. Most of the information we have that nobody was inducted. While in Athens and Corfu, there was a visible level of membership, and I happened to interview people who were members. One of the most fascinating cases was of an individual who was a member of the Athenian chapter, but went to Thessaloniki and was prohibited from taking part in any sort of activities. In Trikala, Anna Gani became a member of Eon during the winter of 1936-37. The Trikala Jewish community was small in composition. The Gani family had assimilated into Greek society and counted many Christian friends. At 14, Anna Gani encountered no difficulty in being accepted and was given the requisite Eon uniform. Even though the Metaxas regime did not consider Greek Jews to be integral members of his new Third Hellenic civilization, they were nonetheless considered citizens of the Greek state. For the 4th of August regime, national loyalty and patriotism were critical factors of national identity, and this helped shape the manner in which Greek Jews were perceived in both domestic and foreign affairs. Until Metaxas' death in 1941, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs openly assisted Jews of both Greek and non-Greek nationality. And when I was doing research at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there were very few documents that I could find at the time regarding any cases. So what I have is based on the limited availability of documents. And for the members of the regime, their concern when examining these foreign affairs issues on whether the Jews were loyal to the Greek state, or whether the Greek Jews were loyal. For those living outside of Greece, government officials consistently raised this question as they deliberated their actions. Of the various issues involving the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I will focus only on one particular situation involving Greek Jewish persecution, and that happens to be in Romania. This situation reflects the general stance of the government and its willingness to protect the Jews from external persecution. In Romania, the rise of fascism and Axis-leaning governments had deleterious ramifications for foreign Jews living in the country. In September 1939, 1 year before Marshal Ion Antonescu would assume dictatorial power as part of the Iron Guard regime, the Romanian government stepped up its anti-Semitic policies. A new directive was issued mandating that all non-Romanian Jews were to leave the country within a fortnight of the law's enactment. Specifically, the law stipulated that, quote, regarding the certificate of religion, it is necessary that you send it to the National Consulate of Certificates where it will be stamped that you are Christian Orthodox. In the case that a stamp is already applied, you need nothing else. The documentation was considered of primary importance in determining whether or not a foreign national was to be granted a new worker's permit. The description of the Romanian law was sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Athens for further instruction. Greek embassy officials in Bucharest had received confidential information that, quote, this measure primarily interests foreign nationals of Jewish religion, whose application for work permits from the outset would be rejected and they would be expelled. The dispatch ends with a query as to what to tell the Greek citizens when they come for official documentation detailing their ethnic origin and religious affiliation. Mavroudis himself responded to the dispatch, and he's the minister, and sent it directly to the Romanian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Michael Antonescu. In this response, dated November 10th, 1939, and stamped urgent, Mavroudis directly confronted Antonescu with the anti-Semitic nature of the new law by stating that the law was directed at foreign nationals of Jewish origin and religion. He stated that processing certificates of religious affiliation by Greek consular authorities was impossible, in view of the fact that the Hellenic Constitution does not make a distinction between Hellenic citizens. Mavroudis concluded his reply by requesting Antonescu intervene before the competent authorities that Hellenic citizens be exempt from this formality in question. Despite the Greek government's refusal to differentiate between Greek Christians and Greek Jews, this did not stop the Romanian Iron Guard regime, as they come in, from differentiating between Greek Christians and Greek Jews living in Romania. The Iron Guard regime dismissed Greek arguments of equality and actively persecuted Greek Jews within their borders. Besides obstructing Jews from acquiring or renewing their work permits, the Romanian government later took steps to uproot Jews from their homes and businesses. This would be followed by relocating Jews to government-established military ghettos. An example of this, of a Greek Jew suffering this discrimination, was Haim Franzis. Franzi was a Greek citizen living in Bucharest since 1900 and purchased a house in 1922. However, in November of 1940, a Romanian military authority ordered him to sell his house and relocate to another house within one of the military zones in the capital. Franzi informed authorities in the Greek embassy concerning his forced relocation, and the Greek embassy quickly intervened on his behalf. The embassy contacted Romanian officials and requested that they take steps to rescind the order and allow Haim Franzi and his wife to live in the house they had purchased 18 years ago. Other Jews were not so lucky. Moises Levy suffered physical and emotional abuse at the hands of the Romanian authorities because of his resistance to sell his business to the Romanian government. In his deposition to authorities at the Greek embassy in Romania, Levy recounted how the Romanian authorities mistreated him, tried to take over his business, and also forced him to leave his residence. Levy's ordeal began on November 1940, on the 24th at 9 a.m., when the local police apprehended him at his house and took him down to the police station. There, he was taken to the basement, where he was tied hand and foot. He had a cloth placed in his mouth to prevent him from making any noises. For 24 hours, Levy was whipped, quote, creating infected black and blue bruises to the lower and back areas of his body. After the beating stopped, Levy was forced to sign a document attesting that he was not mistreated at all in the police station and that they treated him in the best possible manner. When Levy was released from the prison station, he visited a doctor to treat his wounds. The notes that the doctor took were used by the Greek embassy to press their case against the Romanian authorities for Levy's mistreatment. No sooner had Levy returned home than the police came back to his house and apprehended Levy's wife and 82-year-old father. Levy's wife was, quote, mistreated in the worst possible manner, and his father was coerced into selling the family business to the government for the sum of 40,000 lei, despite the fact the business was worth over 400,000 lei. Levy attempted to protest the sale of the business for 1/10 of its value to the local authorities. These same authorities responded by threatening to re-apprehend him and beating him until he died. They told Levy that he and his families had 5 days to gather their personal belongings and leave the country. Levy concluded his letter to the Greek authorities by asking for protection so he and his family could take their possessions and leave. In contrast to Haim Franzi's petition, Moises Levy did not request to remain in his house and keep his business, and this reflected Levy's fear of future persecution and possible death. The Greek embassy in Romania, with the explicit support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Athens, took swift action to secure the safety of the Levy family and to protest the suffering they had endured at the hands of the local Romanian authorities. The Greek minister included a copy of the Romanian doctor's notes as evidence that indeed Levy had been mistreated at the police station. The minister personally requested that the Romanian government guarantee Levy and his family personal safety, in addition to an extension of time for them to liquidate their assets and leave the country. The Romanian response to the Greek dispatch came in the form of a brief note verbal. In this note, The Romanian Minister of Foreign Affairs declared that Moise Levy would be granted a month's extension to this deadline. Levy also had the right to continue running his business until the last day of his extension, December 31st. No mention was made concerning Levy's treatment or about the coerced sale of the Levy's business. In conclusion, while the Ministry of Foreign Affairs maintained Jewish citizenship as the basis by which they were treated in issues concerning foreign relations, foreign affairs officials still harbored negative sentiments towards the Jews as a potential ethnic other. This perception that the Jews had evolved, this perception of the Jews that had evolved throughout the 19th century and continued throughout the Metaxas dictatorship. Jews who resisted territorial integration or linguistic assimilation were viewed as suspect and possibly disloyal citizens of Greece. Regardless of the negative perceptions, both Greek Jews and foreign national Jews viewed Greece as a relatively safe haven during the pre and early interwar, wartime period, Metaxas consistently advocated on behalf of Greek Jews as citizens of Greece and remained resolute in his position until his death in January 41. With the Axis occupation, this protection disappeared. The deportation and destruction of the Jewish communities in Greece erased a historic presence that goes back millennia. Although a number of publications have written about the Holocaust in Greece, there is still more to explore. Catherine Fleming accurately summarized this wartime period by saying, quote, "The story of the destruction of Greece's Jews has served as a vehicle for celebrating Greek Orthodox kindness and valor. And while some Greeks acted heroically in rescuing Jews, at times, Greek Christians were very much complicit in the destruction of Jewish lives. Many more were unmoved by it, and no small number welcomed it. Despite the assistance given by the Metaxas dictatorship to Jews facing persecution, the pre-existing popular and political perceptions of the Jews played a role in shaping the behaviors and responses of Greek Christians after he died and during the Holocaust." Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katerina, for a very fascinating talk. And just for anybody who's joining us online, if you would like to end up asking questions, you can end up doing so by typing in messages to the Q&A box. So start, is there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this, and sorry for running a bit late for it, but so I'm not sure if you might have answered this in the first part that I missed, but you mentioned that Metaxas in a speech at the Jewish community mentioned that the Jewish populace is a kind of newcoming population versus the kind of autochthonous Greeks. Does he pinpoint the time that he sees as kind of, is it a typical narrative that the Jews mostly come kind of 15th, 16th century through expulsion from Spain, so you have the Ladino speakers and all that? Or does he have other pinpoints to kind of show when
even the Romagnots he considers
right.
as those, because they leave after, I think, 70 BCE, the second temple when it falls. So but it's more of a holistic. He wants to give the language that these are people, visitors who come to, like immigrants to our lands. And so in that way, it's kind of like defining who us are and them, and they're welcome to stay here.
Right.
So he provides it as hospitality, Greek hospitality within a Greek Christian kind of environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have a bit of follow-up there. How does it compare to the Spanish experience with Franco at the time? Not with the Jewish population per se, but because you mentioned inclusionists and exclusionists, right? In terms of the Jewish populace in Greece, you can stay, you're here, but you're not one of us. So
right.
With Franco, it was a bit maybe easier to oppress the non-Castilian speakers in terms of everybody's Catholic, at least. So we have that going. But then here, do most of the Jews actually speak Ladino, or do they actually mostly dabble with Greek? Because they had the Torah translated into Greek back in the BC, right? So
yes, okay. So I'm not an expert on Spain, so I'll kind of like segue to the Greek lands. I'll stay in my area, my little toolbox. So that is a very important issue, because during the interwar period, and this is where I kind of see this introspection. So, and I see it in Greek literature as well, like the generation of the 1930s, very much on what does it mean to be Greek? How do we consolidate, Greekness? And language was a characteristic feature in the early 20s, I think 1923, there's an abecedar that's kind of like a little language book for foreign language. And then all of a sudden the Greek government figured out that's a very bad idea, because basically these are Greeks who didn't really understand that they were Greek, but we're going to enlighten them. So they wanted everybody to be linguistically assimilated. This wasn't such a big problem for the Romagnots, who were primarily Greek speakers anyway. So, and they were smaller in number. But when you deal with the Sephardim and coming into Thessaloniki, and I brought this makes me kind of giggle, kind of like in the Andre kind of a giggle. Y'all know what I'm speaking about. So this is 1915, and this is presented by the Greek government. Now, you're just going to focus on one little box, and it's this one. So this is the proportion of, this is Thessaloniki, okay? This is the population. These are Greek Christians, these are Jews, and these are others, predominantly Muslims, okay? And they don't even mention the others. So there is no way this representation is correct. No way. And the Greek government is going to have to really manipulate demographically with the Asia Minor refugees to kind of stage it so the Greeks are the ethnic majority. So the big concern coming, and I'll get to the language part, is that the Sephardim really dominated Thessaloniki. And for the Sephardim and the Via Ignatia, so they're Ladino speakers, with the Alliance Israelite schools that are in the area, they're trying to maintain their cultural identity, individuality. But during the 1930s, as kind of a byproduct of this assimilation, like Greece has grown extensively since the Balkan Wars, we've got a tremendous number of minorities. And if you think about it, after, let's just take World War I, you've got a Jewish population that comes with the Northern Territory of roughly 80 to 90,000 people. And what had existed beforehand, about 15,000. So notice that big number. And they're Sephardic, so they're Ladino speakers. You could look at the synagogues, are based on, the Castilian and Seville and this and that, some Italian. They're going to try to maintain their language. So the Greek government is going to make this huge push for language. And so it becomes an area of conflict, because as language such figured so prominently in Greek identity, there was this push to make sure that they all spoke Greek. So beginning with Venizelos, up through Metaxas, and Metaxas intensified it, they wanted this assimilation. And so many of the schools were resistant. And there were resistance for various reasons. One, because some of these students, if they started to learn Greek, might want to go to Greek state schools, which is actually the fact after 1930. You have a rise in Jews enrolling in Greek state schools, not as many. Secondly, there was a push for Jewish students, if they learned French or that, they would go to Western Europe for tertiary education. And then also kind of went against this growing Zionism, saying this identity, we have to maintain our ideas. We all need to know Hebrew. We're going to go to Palestine, to the Middle East. So having this assimilation really conflicted on multiple levels. So for Metaxas, language was critical. And I'm going to go back because I had so much to say in this presentation. You could tell I had to cut out, and I try to keep the time. So you have your task master, Jamie, who can under 45. And that is the idea of nation, fatherland, and all that. These ideas were something that evolved in the late 19th century. And there were very much de rigueur at the time, that this buttressing of this is our identity, this is who we are. So many times people like to take that notion and identify with other fascist regimes that are kind of developing it. But for Metaxas, it was a continuation of an ideologic intellectual thought that had existed much before. And ironically, it's going to resurface again in another dictatorship in 67 to 74. So this idea, this threat is not kind of sui generis during the interwar period for Greece, but Metaxas kind of embraces this long-standing kind of ideas that had percolated before. And finally, about the language, it takes a very unique place in Greece, because in the 1920s, the debate over Demotic and Katerina, so the popular Greek, the literary Greek, takes on even political dimensions. And so there was a debate about this one school, the Marazzi school, and their use of Demotic, and this huge controversy over what they're teaching in this school, because Demotic took on notions of communism. Malero comunismos, like all these people speak this hairy communist kind of language, undermining our sacred and sacred language and our very identity. So language absorbed a lot more. So when you think about the Jewish minority, it's one of many issues that are incorporated in this idea of what should be spoken, even within the Christian community. Do I speak Demonic? Do I speak Katerina? What I mean? You even had the Bible riots at the turn of the century fighting over the translation of the gospel into Demotic. And how horrid, we'll all go to hell. Sorry, I'm being recorded for reading this version. So I'm sorry, long-winded answer to your question.
This idea of language is really intriguing to me. And it got me thinking in terms of slightly earlier than the time period you're getting at, but the population exchange. So, as we're seeing population exchanges, how is the Jewish population treated here? I mean, you have the Romaniotes, like, are they treated as Greeks in that way, or the Jewish population sort of excluded from that? And then you have the Sephardim who seem to align themselves with the Ottoman Empire. So I'm curious how they figure into that.
Yeah. So this is why I kind of began on the differentiation between the Romaniotes and Sephardim. And you have to go back a little bit, because in the Ottoman period, there is this differentiation. And so the Romaniotes look upon these Sephardim as like these people who come in. What was the term? I have it here. Oh, can't even read my notes anymore. Let me see. They call them as Megorashim, meaning the expelled ones. The Sephardim look at the Romaniotes as Toshavim, as natives. But the Sephardim had this superiority. And they said, we are very educated. We have these skills. The Romaniotes are not as educated. They have lower skilled jobs. They are not as economically prominent. And so we see some tensions. Also, in the religious booklets that they used, how they're going to be reading the Torah, the language is going to be used. They had these kind of tensions. And so when I was interviewing people, I still felt like those are the Thessaloniki Jews. They're different. So within the Greek lands, the old Greek lands, because they were not as numerically prominent, they were not as economically prominent. There were not as many areas of collision. And the fact that they spoke Greek, so they could kind of go under the radar. The Sephardim, linguistic kind of autonomy. We speak a different language. We could be how many of the factories or big industries in Thessaloniki were owned by Jews. Therefore, it's like these wealthy Jews and all that. So when the refugees come in, the biggest conflict is going to be with the Sephardim. So they're coming in. They see the Sephardim as, you don't even speak Greek. You're not Christian. They're the other. The Asia Minor individuals who have been mistreated and kicked out are given grants to set up shops in front of Jewish stores and not pay taxes and not do other things. So we see these economic tensions boiling over. And for the anti-Semitic organization 3E and these attacks, they're actually comprised to a large degree by Asia Minor refugees. Now, Marilena Anastasopoulou, and she just finished up over at Oxford, she's doing about generations of memory for the Asian Minor refugees. I kind of see something going here, and I'm gonna test something, so y'all can tell me if I'm like really out there. I think this displacement of their horrid treatment as they left with nothing but what they had on their backs is transferred then, this anger, to the existing other, because they were the others in the Ottoman Empire. So I see a little bit of translation into that, and it could help me understand what you have the Campbell program in 1931. Why did they set up right in front of the Jewish stores? Why did they say you are, all the tensions and attacks? I kind of see that. Now I'll have to do a lot more work on it, but I kind of see something positive, working out there. I hope that answers your question. Yes, Dimitri.
So you mentioned the own interviews and applications, and what I got is that in Romaniote areas, basically mostly in the south, you have some representation communities managing to make it into EON. Has anyone done? Have you done any work on the connection between these Aeon inductions and the Athenian police work in saving Jews during the Second World War. So do we know if there was Aeon personnel in the Athenian police with these kinds of links into Aeon Jewish members that would have created networks for, let's say, salvation?
This is why you're the head of this program here. That's a brilliant idea. And I'm sure you have lots of graduate students who should take it up as nothing has been done. So that's a new area for exploration. Right now, most of the work that's been done on Aeon either is like trying to connect it with its fascist orientation. So trying to figure out its composition and the propaganda aspect. Prior to what I've really said, the other people who mention Aeon, Mark Mazauer, when he ran it, he said there were no members. No Jews were part of Aeon. And so we're looking at this as a developing field. That would be a fascinating one. The only other component is like what exists today, like of the oral testimonies that had remained. I had conducted them way back, 5 years ago when I was a graduate student, and they were still alive, so I can ask them the question. So now, and also with the destruction of records, that's another problem. So when I was actually doing this preliminary research in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they were actually producing the book on the documents of the Greek Jews. So I had a really incredible opportunity to look at these materials and to bring them into the Jewish archive. So, but there wasn't as much as I would have hoped. So I'd love to see that. Part two.
Things.
Yes, sir.
One random note. I was looking at the Kudzi family archive from the beginning recently, and the Kudzi family were very pro-German from the 19th century. They were vice consuls, consuls of Germany in Lesbos. In the run-up and up to 1941 or something, even later, they have in their archives a lot of Nazi material and references to looking for Jews that reach all the way to them. So for anyone who's just trying to follow these German connections with Greek families, if it's of any interest,
it would be.
It might be.
Yeah.
You mentioned Frizi.
Yes.
So is this
Mordecai.
Mordecai's family members?
I met the family. Yes, I did meet that family because from Evia, it's like going to those kind of close. But there were others as well.
So because and Mordecai is obviously super interesting because this is the kind of person who theoretically would not have been accepted in Aeon. Yeah. But he's a member of the armed forces and a war hero.
Yes. And it goes back to, I'll hit a little bit on literature with this as well, because he sacrificed his life. He was the first Jewish officer to die. And there's a lot written in Greek literature, but Evelakis and others about spilling your blood on this soil. So your connection to Greekness is spilling blood on that soil. You have this immediate and direct kind of contact. So Frizis did this, which reinforces patriotism and sacrifice to the Greek nation and state. So therefore, he's going to be commended. He's going to be celebrated everywhere. What is fascinating is how Metaxas deals with the children. So he says, these are, look what he's done, how wonderful, all of you should all sacrifice. The children are given, they're inducted into Aeon, but they're not inducted as regular members. They're honorary. So you're part, but not part. You're a little different. So you get special uniforms. So even with Frizis giving up his life, these children who are celebrated for their membership are celebrated in a special category, not like any other child. So maybe he didn't intentionally try to do that to kind of set them aside. If he's trying to celebrate them even more by saying, hey, this is honorary, this is even better than regular membership, that's open up to.
So you interviewed one of the children who are an interesting story because basically the Greek collaborationist authorities told the Nazis, you don't touch them because they're children of heroes. So they survived.
Yeah.
I just had a question. You touched on it a bit. It used to be common to frame Metaxas, and still is to an extent, as a fascist and kind of relate into that literature. This is increasingly a challenge, but there's been efforts that kind of reframe Metaxas as a quote clerical fascist, and you see that along with Salazar, what's Franco, these two categories. How do you feel about such appellations? Do you think it's useful, or do you think maybe you can get away with?
Okay, so clerical fascism, how you want to say, from my understanding, is this connection with the politics and religion, mutually supportive. And I don't see this playing out in Greece. And here's just my thoughts on it. One, that we don't see a separation of church and state in Greece as much, so it's embedded. Number two, the divisions that existed were primarily royalist and anti-royalist, and the church was like going to take either side. Number three, the clientelist nature of Greek politics. They didn't even believe in ideology altogether, but rather more of a patronage politics. And lastly, I don't see the Greek political system embracing the kind of liberal interwar democracy like Weimar, what you think of the status of women, sexuality, other components of progressive legislation. You don't quite see that. And so for the 1920s, I think of my infamous Pangalos, and I tell my students about the legislation about the morality of Greek society can be determined by the length of a woman's skirt. So he had police walking around in 26 just measuring women's skirt. So that whole notion of women in the workforce, women doing that, I don't think it quite existed. Going back to what I said earlier about the triad, about religion already being embedded in Greek politics and society so explicitly, there wasn't that separation of church and state. We didn't have like the Protestant Reformation in Greece that kind of create an additional component, and there was no kind of movement for modernity and progressivism. I don't see the clerical fascism quite existing. What I do see in terms of the church, and this is interesting, and it's a direct kind of reflection of what's going to happen during the military dictatorship of 67-74, is that Metaxas didn't happen to like the Archbishop of Athens, the Maskinos. So he said, no, those elections, 1938, forget it. We want Chrysanthos because he's more ideal. So it's all about Venizelism and royalism as opposed to any kind of liberalism, modernity, or revival of Christian ethics. For him, that's like, of course we have these revival, we're just not going to let them go. In 67-74, we had another archiepiscopal election that's going to get canceled to bring Hieronymos, who's going to be supposedly pliant to the junta's directives, which he wasn't to a large extent. So that's another topic. Thank you for your question, though.
I have a question regarding Epsilon, but before that, may I ask something about the population exchange? Since the population exchange was based on religion, the Jewish community of these cities, particularly, were not a part of the population exchange. They were not subject to the exchange, but there was a sizable, in Thessaloniki, there was a sizable crypto-Jewish community. So they were, on paper, they were Muslims, and due to a kind of internal communal conflict, they became subject to the exchange and ended up in Turkey, and they were settled in mostly Constantinople, and they're still around, somehow. And they continue to give some inspiration for some conspiracy theories in Turkey. Still. And my question regarding the organization Epsilon, as you know, Mother Godatus calls them the most significant fascist, proto-fascist organization in the war periods, and it was mainly, as you have already addressed, it was born out of cutthroat competition between the Asia Minor conflict refugees and the Jewish minority of the city. I wonder what happened to them after their dissolution in 1936.
They were banned.
Yeah, they were banned, but they became members of local organizations of the Metaxas regime. I'm asking this because we also know that Metaxas was not the biggest champion of the refugee cause and the refugee identity, refugee subculture, etc.
Oh, yeah.
So what happened to them?
Oh, yeah. So it's kind of a temporary pause. And about the 3 epsilon, Stylianos Gonatas, local official, very much involved in the organization. So they kind of remain latent forces, and they're going to spring up.
Sorry, the leader was Turkish-speaking
Mhm.
refugees.
But they were enabled by the local Greek Christians. So they're going to remain latent, but they're going to resurface with the death of Metaxas. And so that could be linked to a lot of, look at the deportations, the brutality, a lot of other things. You could even go to a case in point, like the cemetery, because they talk about, oh, why was the cemetery done? This was directed by the Nazis, but the Greek Christians were in Thessaloniki. Many of them were more than willing to get rid of that cemetery because they had their own nationalist agenda. So the other point I'll kind of highlight is that after Metaxas dies, slowly, as the collaborationist regimes come in, and I'm not an expert on this period, but they begin to then step by step acknowledge that they're Jews, but then say there's a Jewish problem. And they start using this Jewish problem as leverage for their own political agenda during the occupation period to protect the Greek Christians vis-a-vis Bulgaria and others. So they use them as kind of like, okay, we'll do what the Germans want for this as long as we protect our people. So we start to see a lot of anti-Semitism, and there were many virulent anti-Semites within the Metaxas dictatorship. But there was a lid on because Metaxas was like, I'm going to censor things. Yeah, this is not going to exist. We're going to have stability, and we're going to ban, say, Macedonia from anti-Semitic articles. We're going to ban 3 epsilon. And I'm not going to sit and say he did it in this ideological philo-Semitic reason, but rather as an outcome of his censorship and repressionist policies altogether. You couldn't have other organizations. You couldn't even have the Boy Scouts. So one of the positive aspects for the Jewish community is that by this repression and censorship, some of the means by which they were attacked were suppressed as well. So I just want to condition that a little bit because I don't want to give a very slight.
It's already answered it. The word loyalty kept coming up in the presentation. And I just wondered, my base language, you probably covered. It's kind of a gross question too when I think about it, but what does it mean to be loyal or not be loyal as a Jew?
Depending on the time and context. So this is where I go back to the Greek War of Independence, because I really do think that's a watershed moment for relations, because up until then, Greek Christians, Greek Jews were both minorities. They were dhimmi in the Ottoman Empire. And the Greeks saw the Jews like, you are our fellow oppressed like us. We are attempting to get liberation from our enemy. You need to join forces with us. You are here on the land. You consider yourself Greek. So we're going to rise up. And so the whole factor of who are the Jews going to support during this period, I think shapes perceptions later on. This is why you have Tripolitsa, and I have that image of the slaughter there. Well, individuals from Chalkida or even Macedonia, they were getting financial support for the Greeks in the revolution. They were like volunteer to fight. But this was all kind of set aside because you go from a Gregorius, the patriarch, who's going to get killed. The Jews are going to be tasked to drag him along. You've got primary sources. They bit his ear. They did all sorts of other things and threw him in the water. So all of a sudden, you see this connection between the Jews and the Turks. And the relations between the Greek Christians and the Jews then kind of shifts from co-oppressed minorities to now you are not supportive. During the course of the 19th century, it was all about territorial inclusion. So the Megali idea, as Greece expanded, how would the Jewish communities respond? What I did notice, every time there's a military conflict, the Jews are going to get attacked. There's no big attack when Corfu is peaceably inducted, when Great Britain gives the Ionian Islands. You have the blood libel issue that comes later on that kind of spills out. When you get Thessaly, initially, there were no attacks on the Jews. Later, when there was some violence, was the possibility of Thessaly going back to the Ottomans, then you have the violent attacks. And so the Greeks are saying, where are the Jews fitting in this? We want to expand. And then you have to take the perception of the Jewish communities themselves. Was it in their interest to become part of the Greek state? Again, I'll go back to Thessaloniki. part of the Ottoman Empire, outward facing, cosmopolitan, trade networks going into the Balkans, Mediterranean, etc. So when they are brought into the Greek state, and there are negotiations that go on from 1913, 1917, and different ideas. Austria-Hungary is saying we can have it internationalized. What are we going to do? Venizelos is actively courting them. Their big concern is that we are going to become a second status port subservient to Athens and Piraeus. And they said, we like our position where we are. Our trade networks are going to get cut. We're not going to have the same prominence. So from their perspective, their economic interest were best served by staying within the empire, not because they didn't like the Greeks, but how did the Greeks interpret this? You don't want to be part of the Greek state. The Megalidea is sacred. You have the Virgin Mary and Christ and the Megalidea brought together in one. So if you resist it, then I'm going to attack you. So that's the second context. The third context is in the post-Megalidea period, where it's all about assimilation, not integration, coexisting, maintaining some sort of independence, but linguistically assimilated. The Sabbath rest day laws are going to be implemented. All sorts of new changes are going to be done that undermine many cultural attributes of the Sephardic identity. So if they're resistant to learning Greek, and I have so many documents, like these Jews in Thessaloniki, they've been here for 20 years, they can't speak Greek, and they use the phrase, de milane gri Ellinica, like nothing. And look at these Muslims who are on the border, and they do better on the test. So you see this resistance, it's anti-Hellenic. You don't want our culture, there's something wrong with you. And granted, they weren't treated as badly as the Slavo-Macedonians. If I could use that phrase, that's how Metaxas kind of Slavo-Macedones, they couldn't speak even their language in their house. It would be, you'd have the police come in, Retsinolado, all sorts of interesting things. Tassos Kostopoulos writes about in the Iapagor of Many Gloss of the Forbidden Language. He talks all about that. So, but for the Jews, it's always this litmus test. Are you patriotic? Do you support the Greek cause? Do you support it blindly in the Megalidea? Will you speak, Greek at home, even though you probably would rather go to Paris to go at the university and you don't even know any French?
Getting on the language thing, we had talked last year from Devin Nahr, and he just makes this case with all this evidence that especially from the 30s onwards, there is a concerted effort in the Jewish community to start moving towards the Greek language and to start entering the game. In many ways, responding to exactly this narrative that that you present, the Macedonian newspaper kind of daily, you bloody better learn how to speak. And he shows, that's one of the tragedies, that you have a public perception fomented by the press, and even when the community is trying to adjust, the perception remains that
Correct.
You have this resistance.
Not that I would disagree with Devin, but I'd quibble with him slightly on when this was happening, because 1930 already we see the state school, the enrollments had gone up.
Yeah.
So this is something that had existed well before. It was bearing fruits in the 1930s, yes, but I wouldn't say it is a starting point.
No, I think that might be
Okay. Yeah. And so I remember, what is it? Moises Kofinas Avianen said, the success of this assimilationist policy is that one of the local Jewish schools was closed because all the kids were going to the Greek state school. So they see it as a success story with the Greek state.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, everybody. I would like to thank our speaker once again for an excellent talk and very informative Q&A session, as well as your audience. Before we leave today, I want to let you know about our next presentation, which will take place on Friday, March 1st at 2:30 p.m. with Dr. Cassis of the University of Calgary. Additional information on speakers for the semester can be found on our website at www.sfu.ca/online-studies/. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you at the next talk.
Thank you very much.